Ladies and gentlemen, damas y caballeros, please join me in welcoming our beloved Maria, Sonia Manzano. Welcome, Sonia.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very flattered to be in such a prestigious group of people who have done so many things that I am just really becoming aware of on this visit to San Francisco. What you just saw was my 44-year career on Sesame Street compressed into 3 minutes. I certainly have been on Sesame Street a very long time, and Maria, my character, has paralleled my real life every step of the way. When I first defined myself as a feminist, so did Maria. When I fell in love and got married and then got pregnant and had a baby, so did Maria. I can tell you that her pregnancy was a little easier than mine. Come to think of it, being on Sesame Street so long was a little bit like being on a reality show without the whining. And of course, I had some control about how my life was to be presented on Sesame Street because I was already a writer on the show. Still, you might ask how it's possible that I could stay on the show so long. How many ways can I teach the alphabet to Big Bird? How many times can I possibly correct Elmo about the very same things? Well, the reason I was able to stay on the show for so many years is that every new generation of children gave me another opportunity to get it right and to do better by them. I'll never forget the first time I saw Sesame Street. I walked into the Student Union of Carnegie Mellon University, where I was attending, and there on a screen was a very young, very bald James Earl Jones reciting the alphabet in a very deliberate manner. A, B, C, as the letters flashed over his head. Well, I thought I was watching a show that taught lip reading. But what really struck me was when they cut away from Mr. Jones and I saw Susan and Gordon, this warm, friendly African-American couple, talking to me from a street that looked very much like many of the streets that I had been raised in the South Bronx. And this had a lot of meaning for me, and it's a difficult idea to get across to young people today. But in 1969, you never saw people of color on television. You certainly did not see any Latin people on television either. As a matter of fact, the lack of diversity was not reflected in media in any way. Certainly not in the school learning materials that I dealt with. I learned to read from a series of books called Dick and Jane. Does anybody remember Dick and Jane? These two little blonde children who lived in a suburb. Could their life been more different than mine? They lived in a house, I lived in a tenement. Their mother stayed home and made them pancakes for breakfast. My mother worked in a dress factory and gave me milky coffee and buttered bread for breakfast. Their father went to school in a suit. My father went to work in overalls. Not seeing people like me reflected in society made me feel invisible. And worst of all, it made me wonder how I was going to contribute to a society that didn't see me. The show's original target, Sesame's original target, was underserved African-American children. The idea being that if they began school with the same cognitive skills as their white middle-class peers, they'd have a greater chance at succeeding. And what better way to connect with these children than to have African-American role models like Susan and Gordon, who spoke to them from an environment that they recognized. Sesame Street came out of the exciting late 60s, a time of moon landings, Head Start for the first time, the civil rights movement, of course. Women wanted to join the workforce for the very first time, and they would burn their bras in protest. I think now we'd have to burn our Spankses. But I do not think they burn. I believe they melt. I tried drying a pair with a hair dryer in a hotel room recently, and that was the result. To give you a sense of how people were thinking in those days, I'll read a little bit from the proposal that the creators of Sesame Street gave to the Rockefeller Foundation for funding. I quote, "It is becoming obvious that no one knows what the world is going to be like when the time comes for the younger to live in it. So perhaps the kindest thing we can do is to try not to burden them with the quaint details of today's beliefs and customs, but just attempt to get across a few principles of how things work and how things interact, what is basic in human life, and to acquaint them with as thorough a cross-section as possible of persons, places, and things as they now stand. After that, we can only give them a pat on the back and wish them well." Unquote. Everybody had a political platform in the late 60s. Emilio Delgado and I got cast as Luis and Maria on Sesame Street because Mexican Americans on the West Coast, after seeing how successful Susan and Gordon were to the African American audience, demanded role models for the Latino community as well. I thought Emilio Delgado was an activist before I realized he was an actor, because he would pin a boycott grapes button on everybody he came into contact with in support of Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Union. So after our marriage, Emilio and I became to the Latino viewers what Susan and Gordon were to the African American audience, a nice married couple who had the same hopes and dreams as everyone else in America. We did so well that many people think that Emilio and I are really married. We were accosted once by a fan at an airport, and she went up to us and said how wonderful she thought it was that her child should see real love on television. Well, she took us aback. We stopped for a minute and we told her the truth. We said, "Madam, I'm sorry, but we're not really married." She sucked in her breath and said, "Well, as long as you really love each other." People believe in the Muppets as much as they believed in my marriage to Luis. Big Bird is played by Carol Spinney, an elderly man with white hair. And one day at the studio, he took the top half of his bird suit off, not realizing there was a child nearby. The kid turned to me and said, "Maria, does Big Bird know there's a man in him?" Once again, I marvel at how long my run has been on Sesame Street, but feeling that all good things must come to an end. And as you might know, I decided to leave the show recently. I announced my departure as a segue into the introduction of my memoir at an American Librarians Association convention here in San Francisco in July. And the librarians and teachers tweeted it. By the time I got back to New York, it was national news. So do not underestimate the power of teachers and librarians. Sesame Street went into its 46th season without me. Well, as you can imagine, leaving Sesame Street stirred up many feelings. The most persistent one was asking or singing to myself, "Can you tell me how I got to Sesame Street in the first place?" If you had suggested to me when I was a kid growing up in the South Bronx that I was going to end up on an iconic television show, or on any television show for that matter, I would have suggested you commit yourself to the nearest insane asylum. I had to understand my past to embrace my future. The examination of that journey to Sesame Street, the desire to know where I went wrong and where I went right, when there were so many paths I could have taken, resulted in becoming Maria, love and chaos in the South Bronx. And I'll show you the cover of that book now. There it is. Now, that is not me on the cover, though it certainly could be. But I'll go on to the next picture, and that is the picture of my family. There I am as a little kid. There's my mother in Puerto Rico. I am at a wedding. My father, my family, when we would have to get dressed up, even if we were going to an amusement park on Sunday. My little brother, my scowling sister, and I on Coney Island, and me thinking I'm a hot teen at a park bench in Crotona Park. That's my high school graduation picture, my junior high school class picture where I was obsessed with Kim Novak, and that's why I had to have my hair in a French twist, and an unfortunate 60s hairdo at a wedding. I'm Puerto Rican, born in Manhattan and raised in the Bronx. My parents migrated, Bronxite there. My parents migrated from Puerto Rico after World War II and, like many others, found their way to the mainland United States to escape grinding poverty and find a decent way to live. My father worked on roofs and my mother was a seamstress in a factory, and so they began or continued their never-ending struggle. They struggled with the system. They struggled with speaking English. They struggled so much that the term for the struggle, la lucha, peppered their everyday conversation. When asked how they were doing, they'd say, "Here we are in the struggle." When they answered the phone, they would say, "Here we are in la lucha." But mostly they struggled with each other. My mother struggled with my father's violent, drunken tirades, and my father, I suppose, struggled with his inner demons. Theirs was a cyclical story of domestic violence replaced by hopes, replaced by domestic violence. Hope would take the form of my mother and my siblings running away, and despair would take the form of us circling back. To say the least, it was a very confusing childhood, and I looked to television to find sanctuary and order. I longed for the lifestyles I saw on shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, even though I could not ignore the fact that there were no Latin-looking people on those shows. I still love television. I even love this really weird and twisted show called Queen for a Day. The winners would be the female contestant with the most miserable life. 3 contestants would tell their stories, their tales of woe. Some had children who needed wheelchairs. Others needed a place to live because their houses had been washed away by the rain in Appalachia. Others had been abandoned by husbands. And then the host would hold his hands up the contestant, and with the help of an applause meter and the audience, they would pick the winner. And the winner would get a washer and a dryer because it was brought to you by General Electric. Sadly, I thought my mother would have made a great contestant because the show validated misery. My world or life confusion was compounded by references to Puerto Rico, a place I only saw in pictures. And these 2 pictures fascinated me. And now we're going to go back to the slides, please, and I will forward that. That's my mother in Puerto Rico and my sister. My parents would tell these terrible stories of unrelenting poverty when they lived there. And it was disturbing that they would sometimes laugh at the terrible situations that they were describing. Now, as an adult, I know they laughed in direct proportion to the misery that they had growing up on that island. I was fascinated by this picture because there's my mother looking like Cary Grant is going to come pick her up and take her somewhere. Look at her little spectator pumps and her little peplum skirt. And I thought, how could she be dressed that way and live in such a mean shack? And there's my sister with her little Mary Jane shoes living, and I happen to know that that was a slum that children would drown in because it was built over sewage. I was fascinated by those pictures of Puerto Rico because I had never been there. And then I was further confused by the fact that after my parents would talk about the misery of Puerto Rico, they would feel nostalgic for Puerto Rico. And then they'd bring out their guitars. And then they'd sing about what a wonderful place it was with the breezes and the beautiful women and the palm trees. I can say I was in a confused, depressed, dazed state my whole childhood. Now we're done with those slides, thank you. But media or stories did, in a way, save me because I found some relief, some glimpse of something that I could do when my fourth grade teacher, and this was in the days when teachers could just do things for their students and not have to check with the Board of Ed. My fourth grade teacher, Miss Shirley Pellman, took me, and this is going to sound very corny, she took me to see West Side Story. And I will read a little bit about the impact that that movie had on my life. Folks are chewing popcorn and chattering all around, but when the movie starts, silence falls on the spectators like a blanket from above. The sudden quiet stirs me, and I look up from my lap to the screen. I see the schoolyards, the fences, the buildings, and candy stores I've seen in all my neighborhoods, but here they look different, sharp, clear, bright, and beautiful. What is this that I'm watching? There is something different about the familiar indoor scenes as well. Here, a guitar leaning against the wall looks romantic. The shadows of holy crosses on the homemade altars are so mysterious, I quickly give religion a second thought. And seeing an actress wearing a cross daintily on her chest nails it for me. I too want to wear a sexy cross between my breasts. The colors I see are hot pink and turquoise and purple, but they are bold and important and meaningful, not just loud. I stare at the screen with some mental distance so I can figure and reason, but there's no figuring to do because when the actors sing and dance on the roof about being in America, my heart takes over and begins to beat faster and faster until it makes a racket in my ears that roars. My soul or some power inside me begins to rise and I panic. Will there be enough room in my body for this new feeling? Make way, a voice inside me shouts. I sit up taller because if I don't accommodate this emotion, it will spill out and explode, maybe even hurting those around me. My eyes open wider so I can see everything better. My ears pick up all the musical sounds flowing and crashing into each other in the air, and I wonder, how long had I been sleeping? My God, how long had I been unconscious and missing everything around me asleep? Asleep like a drugged person, like Dennis, the junkie, nodding out on 3rd Avenue. Is Ma right? Am I always daydreaming? Asleep, yes, but daydreaming, no, not really. Daydreams are possibilities. I never daydream anything I think could actually happen. I didn't know what things were possible. So seeing this movie gave me an inkling, I think, as to what art could be. And that moment of realization put me on higher ground. I couldn't control what was going on around me, but suddenly I was able to separate myself from it. Up until then, I didn't know what beautiful things people could create, be it a mambo step, a haunting melody, or a wild color palette. So inspired by the movie, I decided that art was imbuing everyday objects or stories with one's own personal perspective. It was a start. My mother had a beautiful singing country voice, and I think that music put her on higher ground as well. I'm sure that when she sang, she felt herself indomitable, or at least strong enough to face another day. My realizations after seeing that movie did not want to make me be an actress. I was a long way from that. Plus, I still had to make it through elementary school. School was easy for me in the South Bronx. All I had to do was show up. Very little was expected of me. They had a tracking system in place. If you were troubled, disabled, or didn't speak English, you were put in the slow learners class. If you were smart, you were put in the smartest class throughout your career. I excelled in those classes. I could give myself manicures in my desk, dry my fingernails, and answer the questions. I had good teachers and bad ones. A terrible one told me that there were only 3 kinds of people in the world. She told me there was only white people, black people, and yellow people. She chose Brotherhood Week to tell her whole class of Puerto Ricans this fact that she was sure of. She also told me that I was poor. But a good teacher suggested I audition for the High School of Performing Arts, and my world changed. Suddenly, though, I was in competition with middle-class kids, and my grades plummeted. I could not compete socially. I thought the debate was a fight. I struggled every day because if you don't learn the basics of your education when you're very young, you spend the rest of your life catching up. I didn't know what a noun was. I didn't know how to write an essay. By junior year in high school, I wondered how I was going to make it to college on a C average. I wondered how I could be so smart in the Bronx and so dumb in Manhattan. The only way to go to college was to go to a school that accepted you on an audition. However, I couldn't get that audition through the school because I was such a rotten student. So I went around the teacher's back. I got the applications on my own, applied to Carnegie Mellon University on an audition, the same way African-American boys go to school on sports scholarships. And I got into Carnegie Mellon University. My perseverance, thank you. My perseverance and the fact that society was on my side in 69 and 70 got me in. But once again, I'm way up in over my head. I was lucky enough to be cast in a school project that turned into the show Godspell. And it came to New York as I was on my way. My writing started on Sesame Street. While I had fun playing Maria, I knew that the writers were having even more fun than me, especially when I began to question the Latino content. At that time, Sesame Street's culture goals in the Latin curriculum stated that the non-Latin child should know that Latinos are part of America's diverse society and that the Latino child should be proud of his or her culture. So Emilio Delgado and I celebrated quinceañeras and we sang songs in Spanish, and mostly we presented Spanish culture through words. When I was first cast as Maria, I asked them, what was Maria like? And they said, we just want you to be yourself. We just want a real person. We just want real kids to relate to you. So I rose to the occasion of being one of the first Latinas on television by speaking as much Spanish as possible and really being myself. And I spoke the Spanish that I grew up with. Before you applaud, you must hear the rest of this. As you can imagine my surprise when I was told that terms like el rufo for the roof, el jaque for the jacket, and lonchal for lunch were not Spanish words. They were Spanglish words. Well, I was shocked, surprised, discombobulated. So decisions had to be made as to what was more important to present. The real Puerto Rican girl who spoke that way, as everybody in my neighborhood did, or using Spanish that all children could understand. Well, obviously, using Spanish that all children could understand was the way to go. And I wrote accordingly. I wrote a song about being bilingual for Sesame Street called Twice as Nice, a lyric when speaking two languages makes speaking twice as nice. I also wrote I Say Hola, a bit of which you saw on the reel at the beginning of the reel. And there were many bilingual songs on Sesame Street, no matter what your language, Tú me gustas, En escondido. Little did we know that not only did speaking two languages help you communicate with more people, give you a sense of worth and power, but now researchers say it improves cognitive skills not related to languages at all. An article in the New York Times entitled Why Bilinguals Are Smarter It was in March 17th, 2012, and it was a series called Gray Matters, where they examined the brain. It states that researchers, educators, and policymakers long considered a second language to be an interference. Cognitively speaking, now that second language hindered a child's academic and intellectual development, which is the belief before. So, in the old days, being bilingual was considered a hindrance, as we've heard this afternoon. Not anymore, because now the article goes on to state that the so-called interference was a blessing in disguise because it forces the brain to resolve internal conflict, giving the mind a workout that strengthens cognitive skills. The study also said that being bilingual exercises and improves executive function, that it gives kids a heightened ability to monitor their environment. It even said that being bilingual improved kids' social abilities. Well, now the pendulum has swung from being bilingual as a handicap to being bilingual as an asset. I'm so glad that Sesame Street prevailed, and we even have a bilingual puppet, Rosita, to see us through that. What got me into writing prose was Frank McCourt's remarkable and astounding Angela's Ashes, the story of the most miserable Irish childhood you could imagine, written with compassion and love. So I wrote picture books, No Dogs Allowed, and A Box Full of Kittens, and A Miracle on 133rd Street, putting happy endings on difficult childhood experiences. I use everything that happened to me in my life as fodder for books, as I did for acting as Maria. People are often praised for overcoming difficult childhoods on their way to success. I suggest that you can use a difficult upbringing to aid you in becoming successful. I didn't become Maria. I didn't become Maria in spite of my childhood, my chaotic childhood. I became Maria because of that childhood. I write because I remember what happened to me when I was a kid. I'm Maria, always thinking about the child who's watching me, who might have been in the same chaotic situation, who might be in the same chaotic situation that I found myself in. Society is getting more and more complex as we get diverse. The complexity of the issue was made clear to me when I saw a movie called Real Women Have Curves. Many of you know this movie. In it, a Mexican-American woman struggles because she receives a full scholarship. She lives on the West Coast, and she gets a full scholarship to Columbia University. The families in New York City, the family's dilemma is that they were so close-knit, they could not let her go. Well, I left that movie thinking it was an unrealistic premise. What parent doesn't want to let their kid accept a full scholarship to an Ivy League school? Only shortly thereafter, I visited a community in Brownsville, Texas, that was struggling with that very same problem. Those families were so closely knit, they couldn't let their kids accept scholarships to out-of-state schools or even accept lucrative internships. I've heard of other families that come from cultures where there's always an aunt or an uncle there to take care of the kid, so he never has to attend preschool. Unfortunately, that means the child starts school at a disadvantage without the social skills that his middle-class peers might have. So you could say that some very fine family values could stand in the way of certain children succeeding in American culture. I was raised in an environment where you never questioned adults. I was 10 years old before I realized you could ask a teacher a question. I was in math class, and the poor teacher was trying to teach long division to a group of very obedient, well-behaved Puerto Rican kids. And we stared at him trying to comprehend what he was trying to tell us, when suddenly I couldn't bear it anymore, and a question burst out of my mouth. He did the remarkable thing. He answered my question, and a world opened up to me. Being obedient and shy might have helped me survive if I lived in a repressive religious culture of 1950s Puerto Rico, which is why my mother taught me to be that way. But it doesn't do a thing for me to survive in America. I'm compelled to comment on the political atmosphere that we live in. When I was in elementary school, I remember singing the Pledge of Allegiance and having my heart swell with pride and patriotism. I felt this was the best country in the world with the smartest people, the most compassionate and caring people. I felt that even as I felt the disdain of teachers because I was poor and brown. I felt it even as I suspected my parents were being exploited. I felt it even as I was feeling marginalized. I don't know where I got those feelings. And when I was in my 20s and I began to see the faults of our society, I still felt it. Those feelings remain now. So I wonder what I'm supposed to do with these feelings when some of the presidential hopefuls say things that would have gotten me sent to the principal's office. My mother would have had to come in. She would have washed my mouth out with soap. Am I to forget everything that I learned in the South Bronx? I don't have an answer. But I know that events such as the California Association of Bilingual Education will help us get through these intolerant times because we work with kids. Things continue to change for children because we have become a data-based society. We assess and analyze and test children before they even get a chance to experience the joys of thinking. Using one's imagination is taking a back seat to experience, and all we want kids to do is memorize facts and data. We want kids to spout out information we give them, excluding what they bring to the table. The bilingual child will always bring more to the table because he has nuance and he can infer and he sees different colors. Our work is difficult to do because we live in a society that makes believe it cares for children. When budgets need cutting, the first cuts to go are things that improve the lives of our most vulnerable citizens. But we must not despair because we don't have to have all the answers. Children are resilient. They give us strength. Education is a two-way street, and we learn from them even as we teach them. We can guide them, but they're born with their own set of characteristics. As educators and people of goodwill, all we have to do is point kids in a certain direction and watch them fly. At Sesame Street, we realize kids pick up much more than we thought, are much more intuitive than we thought. My own daughter once asked me, "Mom, do dogs know what they look like?" Another time she said to me in an accusing tone, "When you and Daddy were kids, I didn't have any parents." Young people have their own strengths, ideas, and opinions. They are born confident. My daughter said to me when she was on Sesame Street, "Why do I have to make believe you're my mother if you really are my mother?" How many of us look at kids and say, "Where did you get such an idea?" They get it from their own way of perceiving the world. They're all born confident. I have looked into a crowd of kids and asked, "Who can sing and dance?" Don't they all raise their hands? And if you say, "Hey, you, the cute one, turn around," they will all turn around. I suggest we nurture their unbound spirit. We all know young people who come from terrible, chaotic, troubled families rise above it and somehow live through the chaos around them successfully. On shows now on television, you watch these poor Syrian refugees trying to find a place to live, a place to land, and some kid will catch the camera's eye and smile. I've seen photos in newspapers of war-torn places, photos of barricades set up to protect soldiers from conflict. And you'll see kids in those same photos using these barricades as playground apparatus. like they just found the perfect place to play hide and seek. Each generation on some level hopes and even assumes the next one will be better. We hope that someday that young people will see more things more clearly than we have and be more compassionate than we have been. I firmly believe in our collective can. We believe the young will show us the way. That's why we love the moment in Spielberg's movie E.T., when the kids are on their bicycles running away from the well-meaning FBI guys, and all of a sudden the kids take off on their bicycles and cross the moon, and everybody in the audience goes, oh, we just love it. The kids are going to save us. They will set us free. So thank you very much, California Association of Bilingual Education, for inviting me for your prestigious event, for keeping the hope alive for all children, especially for bilingual children, by turning what was described as a handicap into an asset, and maybe help us move forward from evaluating children by how many facts they know and go to applauding them instead for how well they can think. Gracias. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia Manzano, for that inspirational message and for sharing the stories of your remarkable life and career.